Under the soft late afternoon light spilling across Summer Bay, everything initially appears deceptively calm, almost as if the town is holding its breath before something inevitable breaks through. Mackenzie and Levi share a rare moment of stillness inside Salt, where the ordinary rhythm of life briefly gives way to something far more fragile and profound. As Mackenzie gently guides Levi's hand to her stomach, the world around them seems to fade, leaving only the quiet reality of what they have endured and what they are now daring to hope for again. This is not simply a moment of excitement about a baby on the way, but a deeply emotional turning point for two people who have already experienced devastating loss. Their earlier miscarriage still lingers in the background of everything they do, shaping the way they approach this new pregnancy with both joy and fear intertwined. Levi, usually composed and restrained, allows himself to soften in a way that reflects how far he has come emotionally, even if he does not fully put it into words. Instead, his reaction is carried through subtle gestures and silence, revealing a man slowly reconnecting with hope after a long period of emotional distance. Mackenzie, watching him carefully, understands that this moment represents something much bigger than just reassurance. It is a shared rebuilding of trust in the future they almost lost. At the same time, elsewhere in Summer Bay, a very different emotional current begins to surface. Marley receives a phone call that immediately shifts his entire demeanor, his body language tightening as whatever he hears on the other end of the line clearly unsettles him. The change is immediate and telling, suggesting that something outside the bay is beginning to intrude on the fragile stability that has recently been forming among the residents. On Saxon Avenue, Eden finds herself caught in an increasingly difficult emotional space with Cash, as the pressures of his role in the police force continue to spill over into their relationship. What once felt like a strong and unshakable bond is now being tested by unspoken fears and growing uncertainty about whether love alone is enough to withstand the weight of duty and consequence. Eden's emotional vulnerability becomes more visible here, as she struggles not only with what is happening between them, but also with the fear that they are slowly drifting apart without knowing how to stop it. Meanwhile, outside the surf club, Abigail sits quietly as Richie, the new Yabby Creek constable, stays close by in a calm but slightly guarded manner. His presence is steady, almost reassuring on the surface, yet there is something about him that feels tightly controlled, as though he is constantly measuring both himself and the world around him. Richie's confidence, particularly when it comes to firearms and police procedure, is noticeable and somewhat unsettling, especially in a town like Summer Bay where such things rarely belong in everyday life. At Summer Bay Fit, Sonny continues pushing himself physically in a way that increasingly feels less like training and more like punishment. His determination to regain control over his body after the trauma of the train crash has become borderline obsessive, and Remy watches this escalation with growing concern. Despite Remy's attempts to intervene and slow him down, Sonny resists, driven by a need to prove he is no longer defined by what happened to him, even as the signs of strain become harder to ignore. Across town, Justin carries a quiet heaviness that reflects the mounting pressures in his life, though there are brief moments where that weight is lifted through his connection with Leah. Their time together on the beach offers a temporary escape from everything that has been building around them, grounding Justin in something familiar and emotionally stabilizing, even if only for a short while. It is a reminder that in Summer Bay, moments of peace are often temporary, existing only in contrast to the instability that follows. Elsewhere, Tane and Harper appear with Archie in a scene that presents them as a functioning family unit, attempting to maintain stability after everything they have been through. However, beneath the surface, their relationship still carries unresolved tension and emotional residue from past conflicts, particularly around trust and external interference. Archie represents both their connection and their responsibility, anchoring them together while also reminding them of everything they stand to lose if things fall apart again. Mackenzie later reappears in a lighter family moment at Salt, interacting warmly with Archie in a way that briefly restores a sense of normality to the bay. The scene carries a gentle warmth, almost like a pause in the tension building elsewhere, yet it also feels fleeting, as though it exists on borrowed time. Summer Bay has a habit of allowing happiness to surface only briefly before pulling it back into uncertainty. As these separate threads continue unfolding, Alf and Rue find themselves in a strained emotional exchange that reveals underlying hurt and disappointment within their relationship. What is said between them is less important than what remains unspoken, as both struggle with expectations, loyalty, and the fear of letting each other down. The emotional distance between them feels small but significant, hinting at a deeper fracture that has not yet fully surfaced. By the time Richie suddenly shifts into urgent action, the tone of the entire narrative changes sharply. His movement is immediate and decisive as he rushes toward his vehicle, clearly responding to something that requires full attention and speed. The calm that had briefly held Summer Bay together is broken in an instant, replaced by urgency and anticipation of crisis. As he drives off at speed, sirens cutting through the air, the sense of impending danger becomes impossible to ignore. Something serious is unfolding, though the details remain unclear, leaving both the characters and the audience suspended in uncertainty. The promo's underlying tension reaches its peak here, reinforcing the idea that whatever is about to happen will not be contained or easily resolved. And with the final implication that someone in Summer Bay will be shot, the entire sequence settles into a single haunting question, not just who is in danger, but how far the ripple effects will spread once the first shot is fired. As the tension from Richie's sudden departure begins to ripple across Summer Bay, the atmosphere shifts from uneasy calm into something far more volatile, as though the entire town is unknowingly edging closer to a breaking point. What began as isolated emotional disturbances among individual residents slowly starts to feel interconnected, each storyline feeding into a larger sense of impending crisis. At Northern District's hospital, the emotional weight of recent events becomes immediately apparent as Joe and Lacey find themselves in a shared moment of vulnerability, both visibly affected by whatever situation is unfolding beyond their immediate control. The hospital environment, usually associated with stability and recovery, instead becomes a space of anticipation and dread, suggesting that whatever incident has occurred or is about to occur will have serious physical and emotional consequences. Lacey's presence in particular carries a heavy psychological undertone, as her history of trauma and the lingering aftermath of her violent confrontation with Holden continue to shape the way she reacts to situations involving danger, loss, and uncertainty. Even without explicit details being revealed in the promo, her emotional state reflects someone who is already living with the consequences of violence, making the possibility of another traumatic event feel dangerously close to the surface. Joe, meanwhile, appears increasingly unsettled in a quieter but more internalized way, as though fragments of memory and suppressed understanding are beginning to resurface. Her connection to past events within the Langham family continues to sit beneath everything she does, and in moments like this, where fear and uncertainty are heightened, those buried memories feel closer to breaking through. The hospital setting amplifies this tension, suggesting that truth and trauma are once again converging in ways that cannot be avoided. Elsewhere, David Langham is seen back at the police station, operating in his familiar role of authority and control, yet there is a noticeable undercurrent of strain in his presence. As a senior figure within law enforcement and also the father of two daughters deeply affected by recent events, he is positioned at the center of both professional and personal pressure. His role in any unfolding incident is not just procedural but deeply emotional, as every decision he makes carries consequences that extend beyond his job and into his fractured family life. At the same time, Mackenzie is shown in a separate moment in tears, which sharply contrasts with the earlier warmth of her storyline with Levi. This emotional shift suggests that whatever sense of hope had briefly returned is now under threat, reinforcing the idea that happiness in Summer Bay is always fragile and often interrupted without warning. Her distress is not fully explained in the promo, but it aligns with the broader pattern of emotional escalation building across multiple households. Richie re-enters the sequence in a far more intense context, as he is seen standing over someone in a moment that immediately raises the stakes of the entire storyline. The framing of this scene strongly implies a confrontation or aftermath situation, where decisions have already been made and consequences are now unfolding in real time. His earlier confidence around firearms and police action now takes on a more ominous tone, suggesting that his involvement may be directly connected to the emerging threat. This is followed by a brief but significant visual of Levi in tears, which deepens the emotional uncertainty surrounding the Fowler family. Given his medical background and his emotional investment in both Mackenzie and his wider family, his distress hints at a situation involving either personal loss or a critical medical emergency. The juxtaposition of his earlier hope with this moment of visible grief reinforces the unpredictable emotional shifts that define this promo. The sequence then expands outward once more, briefly touching on several other residents across Summer Bay, including familiar figures whose presence serves to underline how widespread the impact of this developing crisis is likely to be. Joe and Lacey are once again shown in distress at the hospital, suggesting that the situation they are connected to is either escalating or being confirmed as serious. Meanwhile, David's presence at the station reinforces the law enforcement dimension of the storyline, indicating that official response efforts are now fully underway. By this stage, the narrative structure of the promo becomes increasingly fragmented, deliberately cutting between emotional reactions rather than providing clarity. This editing style reinforces the central uncertainty of the storyline, where no single character appears to have the full picture, and every reaction is filtered through shock, fear, or confusion. The emotional intensity continues to build as Richie is shown again in a more grounded but still highly charged moment, reinforcing the idea that he is directly involved in the unfolding incident. Whether as a responder or participant, his positioning within the sequence suggests that he is at the center of whatever critical event is developing, linking his earlier confidence with a far more serious outcome. As the montage progresses, Mackenzie reappears once more, still in tears, further amplifying the sense that her storyline is about to be significantly affected by whatever is occurring. The repetition of emotional distress across multiple characters begins to create a pattern, implying that the incident is not isolated but instead has the potential to impact several interconnected relationships simultaneously. The final moments of this segment of the promo return to Richie, who is once again shown in a heightened state of urgency, reinforcing the idea that time is running out and that whatever situation is unfolding is reaching its critical stage. His movements, combined with the escalating reactions of other characters, suggest that the narrative is rapidly converging toward a single, unavoidable event. And as the emotional fragments across Summer Bay begin to align, the underlying question becomes increasingly clear: not just who is involved, but how many lives will be permanently altered by what is about to happen, especially as the looming threat of a shooting edges closer to reality. As the promo builds toward its most intense phase, the emotional fragmentation across Summer Bay begins to converge into something more focused and far more dangerous, as though every separate storyline is being pulled toward a single, unavoidable point of impact. What was once a series of disconnected personal struggles now feels like a chain reaction waiting to detonate. At Summer Bay Fit, Sonny's physical decline becomes more visible as his relentless training begins to push him beyond safe limits, despite repeated warnings from those around him. His determination to regain control after the trauma of the train crash has gradually shifted into something more self-destructive, as if endurance itself has become his only measure of worth. Remy's concern grows more urgent as he witnesses Sonny ignoring clear signs of strain, yet his attempts to intervene continue to be met with resistance rooted not in anger, but in denial and pride. This storyline adds another layer of tension to the broader narrative, as it highlights how trauma in Summer Bay rarely remains contained within a single character. Instead, it spreads through behavior, relationships, and increasingly risky decisions, creating conditions where emotional instability can easily translate into physical danger. Elsewhere, Justin is shown grappling with mounting pressure, his internal conflict reflecting the broader instability affecting multiple households across the Bay. While his moment with Leah earlier provided brief emotional relief, that sense of grounding appears increasingly fragile as external stresses continue to build. His storyline reinforces the idea that even long-established relationships in Summer Bay are not immune to disruption when crisis begins to spread through the community. At the same time, Alf and Rue are once again brought into focus through a deeply emotional exchange that underscores unresolved tension within their family dynamic. Alf's sense of disappointment is no longer subtle, and Rue's attempts to reassure him carry an emotional weight that suggests past misunderstandings are still unresolved beneath the surface. Their relationship, while not directly connected to the central incident, reflects the broader theme of fractured trust that runs through the entire promo. Mackenzie reappears briefly in a moment that sharply contrasts earlier warmth, as her emotional state continues to fluctuate in response to the growing uncertainty around her. Having already been shown experiencing joy, fear, and distress within the same promo sequence, her storyline now feels increasingly unstable, suggesting that whatever is coming will directly affect her in a significant and personal way. The emotional volatility surrounding her reinforces the sense that no character is being positioned outside the reach of the upcoming crisis. Meanwhile, Levi is shown in a more distressing emotional state, his earlier calm replaced by visible grief. The shift in his expression suggests that the situation unfolding is no longer hypothetical or distant, but something that has already begun to impact those closest to him. As a doctor, Levi's reactions carry additional weight, as his understanding of injury and consequence makes his emotional response more grounded and alarming, hinting that the stakes may involve serious physical harm. This moment further intensifies the underlying fear that the promo has been building toward, the possibility of a shooting involving someone deeply embedded within the Summer Bay community. The emotional reactions are no longer abstract or anticipatory, they are increasingly direct, as if the consequences are already being felt before the event has fully played out. The sequence then briefly returns to Richie, whose presence continues to anchor the escalating tension. His positioning within the unfolding events suggests he is no longer simply reacting, but actively involved in the critical moments leading up to the incident. Whether through pursuit, intervention, or direct confrontation, his role appears central to the moment where everything changes. As he moves through the unfolding situation with urgency, the editing deliberately avoids revealing full context, instead focusing on fragmented visuals that heighten confusion and anticipation. This stylistic choice reinforces the idea that the truth of what is happening is still just out of reach, even as its consequences begin to manifest across multiple characters. By this stage, the promo no longer functions as a collection of separate storylines, but rather as a single escalating event viewed through different emotional perspectives. Each character's reaction, fear, grief, anxiety, or confusion, contributes to a growing sense that Summer Bay is on the verge of a major, irreversible turning point. And as the final fragments of this section unfold, the weight of the central question becomes even more unavoidable. When the shooting finally happens, it will not just be an isolated act of violence, but a moment that permanently reshapes every connection, every relationship, and every fragile sense of safety that Summer Bay still has left. As the promo enters its final stretch, the tone shifts decisively from escalating tension into outright emotional collapse, where every storyline converges into a shared sense of dread that can no longer be contained by individual perspective. Summer Bay, once again, becomes less a place of everyday life and more a pressure point where fear, grief, and uncertainty collide. The hospital imagery returns with increased intensity, as Joe and Lacey are once again shown in a state of emotional distress, now joined by other figures who appear to be reacting to something far more serious than a routine emergency. The environment itself feels charged, as though the corridors are no longer just a place of treatment but the center of unfolding tragedy. The repeated presence of tears, shock, and urgency strongly suggests that the incident at the heart of the promo is no longer imminent. It has already begun to unfold, and its consequences are now being processed in real time. David Langham's presence at the police station becomes more dominant in this segment, reinforcing the institutional response to what is clearly a critical incident. His posture and expression reflect a man under extreme pressure, not only as a senior officer managing a rapidly developing situation, but also as a father already emotionally entangled in the broader network of affected individuals. The duality of his role intensifies the weight he carries, as professional responsibility and personal fear begin to overlap in ways that cannot be neatly separated. At the same time, Mackenzie's emotional breakdown reappears, this time more pronounced and sustained, suggesting that whatever she is reacting to has moved beyond anticipation into direct impact. Her distress is no longer isolated or ambiguous, it is part of a wider emotional wave affecting multiple characters across Summer Bay. The repetition of her grief across different moments of the promo reinforces her position as one of the central emotional anchors of the unfolding storyline. Richie's storyline then escalates sharply as he is shown in close proximity to a critical situation, his movements urgent and controlled in a way that suggests he is operating under extreme pressure. The framing of these scenes implies that he is either responding to or directly involved in the key incident that has been building throughout the promo. His earlier confidence and familiarity with firearms now carries a far more serious undertone, as the narrative positions him closer to the center of potential violence than ever before. The editing becomes increasingly fragmented at this stage, cutting rapidly between faces and reactions rather than providing linear progression. This structure intensifies the sense of chaos, as viewers are no longer guided through events but instead placed inside the emotional aftermath of something that is actively unfolding. The lack of clarity is deliberate, heightening suspense and reinforcing the idea that no single character has full control over what is happening. Levi's emotional arc is revisited once again, now showing a deeper level of visible distress, which contrasts starkly with the earlier hopefulness surrounding his relationship with Mackenzie. As a doctor, his reactions carry additional gravity, as his understanding of trauma and injury allows him to immediately grasp the seriousness of what is occurring. His visible grief suggests that the consequences of the incident are no longer theoretical but already tangible and irreversible. Sonny's storyline, while still physically separate from the central event, continues to echo the broader theme of instability. His physical strain at the gym becomes symbolic of the wider emotional and psychological pressure affecting multiple characters across Summer Bay. Even in isolation, his actions reflect the same pattern of pushing beyond limits until something inevitably breaks, mirroring the structural tension of the promo itself. Justin and Leah briefly reappear in a softer emotional moment, but even this is overshadowed by the dominant tone of unease that permeates every other storyline. Their connection, while still present, feels fragile against the backdrop of a community on the brink of crisis. The contrast between their intimacy and the surrounding chaos highlights how quickly stability can be disrupted in Summer Bay, even for those who appear removed from direct danger. As the sequence builds toward its climax, the promo returns once more to Richie, whose presence becomes increasingly central to the unfolding narrative. His positioning within the final scenes suggests he is at or near the exact point where the critical incident reaches its peak. The combination of urgency, movement, and emotional reaction from surrounding characters strongly indicates that he is either witnessing or directly involved in the moment that defines the entire storyline. At this stage, the promo no longer differentiates between cause and consequence. Instead, it presents a series of overlapping emotional responses that together form a single, escalating crisis. Fear, shock, grief, and confusion merge into a collective atmosphere that signals the inevitability of what is about to happen. And as the final images begin to form, the sense of anticipation becomes absolute. Summer Bay is no longer simply reacting to a developing threat, it is standing at the exact moment before irreversible change, where one decision, one movement, or one single shot will determine which of its residents is about to be forever altered. As the promo reaches its final moments, Summer Bay is no longer portrayed as a place of unfolding events but as a community already standing inside the aftermath of something catastrophic, where the emotional responses have overtaken clarity and every character is now reacting to a reality that feels irreversible. The montage begins to tighten around the hospital once again, where grief, shock and disbelief converge in a way that signals the true scale of what has happened. Joe and Lacey are seen overwhelmed with emotion, their reactions no longer suggesting uncertainty but confirmation that a life-threatening event has already taken place. The repeated imagery of distress within the hospital corridors reinforces the idea that this is where the consequences of the shooting are becoming fully visible, even if the full identity of the victim remains concealed. David Langham's presence becomes even more significant in these final images, as his role at the station now carries the full weight of command during a critical incident. His expression reflects a man forced to process both operational urgency and personal fear simultaneously, as the boundaries between professional duty and family involvement continue to blur. The implication is clear that this event is not just another case for the police, but something that has deeply embedded itself into his personal world. Elsewhere, Mackenzie is shown again in a heightened emotional state, her distress now appearing fully connected to the unfolding tragedy. The repetition of her tears across multiple shots suggests she is either directly affected or closely linked to the victim, reinforcing her position as one of the central emotional figures in the aftermath. Her storyline, once defined by hope and renewal, is now being reshaped by fear and uncertainty. Levi's reaction becomes even more devastating in these final moments, as his visible grief confirms that the situation involves someone he is emotionally or professionally tied to. As a doctor, his response carries a particular weight, because it is rooted not only in personal feeling but also in medical awareness of severity and loss. His breakdown signals that the incident has crossed a threshold where recovery may no longer be possible. Richie is then shown in a crucial final sequence, positioned in direct proximity to the incident that has been building throughout the entire promo. His presence in these closing frames strongly implies that he is either witnessing the aftermath of the shooting or directly involved in the chain of events leading up to it. The earlier focus on his familiarity with firearms now casts a long shadow over these final visuals, raising questions about how deeply he is connected to what has occurred. The editing at this stage becomes almost disorienting, cutting rapidly between faces of grief, shock and disbelief across multiple locations in Summer Bay. Eden, Cash, Sonny, Justin, Leah, Alf, Rue and others are shown reacting in fragmented bursts, suggesting that the impact of the shooting is not isolated but spreading rapidly through the entire community. This structure reinforces the idea that Summer Bay operates as an interconnected emotional ecosystem, where one violent act reverberates across every relationship. The final hospital sequence intensifies this sense of collective trauma, with multiple characters gathered in a shared space of uncertainty and grief. The emotional reactions here are no longer anticipatory but fully grounded in consequence, implying that the identity of the victim has either been revealed or is on the verge of being confirmed. The repetition of tears and shock across familiar faces makes it clear that the shooting has struck someone deeply embedded within the core of the community. As the montage slows, the focus narrows once more, drawing attention back to the central question that has driven the entire promo from the beginning. The sense of inevitability becomes overwhelming, as all narrative threads converge into a single, unresolved moment of truth. And then, finally, the promo delivers its final blow. Because one of them will be shot. The words land with full weight, now stripped of speculation and transformed into certainty. The list of potential victims flashes through the mind: Levi, Mackenzie, Marley, Eden, Cash, Abigail, Richie, Remy, Sonny, Justin, Leah, Tane, Harper, Archie, Dana, Alf, Rue, David, Joe, Lacey, every one of them equally exposed, equally vulnerable, equally connected to the same fragile world. Only two names remain absent from the chaos: John and Marilyn, quietly positioned outside the storm, implicitly framed as safe by omission. But for everyone else, Summer Bay is no longer a place of safety or routine. It is a countdown. A moment suspended between life and loss. And when the shot is finally fired, nothing in Summer Bay will ever return to what it was before. In the aftermath of the promo's final declaration, the tone of Summer Bay shifts once more, as if the narrative is no longer moving toward an event but instead being pulled backward through its consequences. The imagery begins to feel heavier, more grounded in emotional aftermath than anticipation, suggesting that the shooting is no longer a future possibility but a present reality whose effects are already tearing through the community. The hospital becomes the central emotional hub once again, but now the energy is different. It is no longer about confusion or uncertainty, but about processing loss, fear, and irreversible change. Characters are shown in fragmented states of shock, with conversations replaced by stunned silence and emotional breakdowns. Joe and Lacey remain at the center of this space, their reactions suggesting that whatever has happened has directly impacted someone within their immediate emotional orbit, intensifying the sense of personal devastation. David Langham's presence at the station continues to reflect the dual pressure of authority and personal entanglement, as he is forced to navigate a situation that is no longer purely procedural. His expressions and movements suggest a man operating under extreme internal conflict, where professional responsibility is no longer separable from emotional consequence. The weight of command becomes heavier as more information filters in, though none of it offers clarity that could soften the impact of what has occurred. Elsewhere, Mackenzie's emotional trajectory reaches a deeper level of distress, with her reaction now firmly anchored in grief rather than anticipation. The earlier optimism surrounding her pregnancy storyline has been completely overshadowed by the unfolding crisis, reinforcing how quickly stability can be dismantled in Summer Bay. Her tears no longer reflect uncertainty, but the beginning of acceptance that something irreversible has taken place. Levi's grief intensifies in parallel, his emotional response now fully aligned with someone who has either witnessed the immediate aftermath of trauma or has received confirmation of a devastating outcome. As a doctor, his breakdown carries additional narrative weight, as it implies not only emotional loss but professional recognition of severity. His presence reinforces the idea that the shooting has reached a level where even those trained to deal with crisis are unable to remain detached. Richie's role becomes increasingly ambiguous in these final layers of the promo structure. His earlier positioning near critical moments now takes on a more complex tone, as he appears within the aftermath space rather than the action itself. This placement leaves his involvement open to interpretation, but undeniably central to the unfolding chain of events. Whether as responder, witness, or participant, his connection to the incident remains one of the key unanswered questions driving the tension forward. The editing continues to fragment reality across Summer Bay, showing overlapping reactions from Eden, Cash, Sonny, Justin, Leah, Alf, Rue, and others in rapid succession. Each reaction contributes to a growing sense of communal fracture, where no single storyline exists in isolation anymore. The shooting has effectively dissolved the boundaries between individual narratives, pulling every character into a shared emotional aftermath that cannot be contained within one household or relationship. At this stage, Summer Bay itself feels fundamentally altered. The familiar spaces, the hospital, the surf club, the beach, the streets, are no longer just settings for daily life but stages upon which collective trauma is being processed. The sense of place begins to dissolve into a psychological landscape defined by shock and consequence. The promo does not attempt to resolve any of the emotional threads it has introduced. Instead, it deepens them, layering grief upon uncertainty, and uncertainty upon fear, until the viewer is left with a single overwhelming impression that everything in Summer Bay has shifted permanently, even before the full details are known. And as the final emotional echoes fade, what remains is not clarity, but inevitability. One resident has been shot. The only question left is not if Summer Bay will change, but how many of its lives will be permanently broken in the moment that follows. In the final stretch of the promo narrative, Summer Bay is no longer presented through the lens of unfolding events or even immediate aftermath, but as a community suspended in the emotional void that follows irreversible violence. Every image, every reaction, every fragmented cut now feels like it belongs to a world that has already been permanently altered. The hospital once again anchors the emotional core, but now its atmosphere is defined by confirmation rather than uncertainty. The repeated visual emphasis on grief-stricken faces suggests that the identity of the shooting victim is no longer an abstract mystery but a devastating reality that has already begun to ripple through the lives of those closest to them. Joe and Lacey's emotional breakdowns take on a heavier tone, implying not just shock, but personal loss that will redefine their entire family dynamic moving forward. David Langham is shown once more in his role at the police station, but the weight he carries now feels absolute. His presence reflects a man confronting the full consequences of a crisis that has moved beyond containment, where every decision made under his authority now carries irreversible human cost. The boundary between professional duty and personal devastation has completely dissolved, leaving him trapped in a space where neither role offers relief. Mackenzie's emotional state reaches its most intense point in these final images, her grief no longer fragmented but fully realized. The earlier contrast between hope and fear in her storyline has collapsed entirely into loss, suggesting that the shooting has directly impacted someone within her closest emotional circle. Her presence in the final montage reinforces the idea that Summer Bay's tragedies are never isolated, they radiate outward, touching every connected life. Levi's reaction mirrors this emotional collapse, his visible grief now aligned with a deeper understanding of consequence, both medical and personal. As a doctor, he represents one of the clearest emotional indicators of severity, and his breakdown confirms that what has occurred is not survivable in emotional terms for at least one of the community's core relationships. His earlier hope has been fully replaced by devastation. Richie remains one of the most ambiguous figures in the closing moments, his positioning continuing to sit uncomfortably close to the center of the incident. The promo carefully avoids defining his exact role, instead allowing his presence to function as a focal point of tension. Whether he is witness, responder, or something more directly involved, his connection to the shooting remains one of the key unresolved threads that lingers beyond the final frame. The rapid montage of reactions across Eden, Cash, Sonny, Justin, Leah, Alf, Rue, and others reinforces the scale of the impact, showing that no corner of Summer Bay remains untouched. Each reaction, though brief, contributes to a larger emotional map of a community in shock, where individual grief merges into collective trauma. The shooting is no longer just an event affecting a single storyline, but a rupture that reshapes the entire social fabric of the Bay. As the final sequence settles, the promo deliberately withholds clarity, choosing instead to emphasize emotional consequence over factual resolution. The absence of a clear victim identity in the final moments intensifies the tension, ensuring that anticipation carries forward into the upcoming episodes with maximum uncertainty. And then, in its final echo, the promo returns to its central statement, no longer as a tease, but as a declaration that now feels final and inescapable. Because one of them will be shot. The screen no longer suggests possibility. It confirms inevitability. And as the list of Summer Bay residents lingers in the mind, Levi, Mackenzie, Marley, Eden, Cash, Abigail, Richie, Remy, Sonny, Justin, Leah, Tane, Harper, Archie, Dana, Alf, Rue, David, Joe, Lacey, the absence of certainty becomes the most powerful force of all. Only John and Marilyn remain untouched by implication, standing outside the frame of danger, their safety implied not by protection, but by omission. Everything else is left suspended in uncertainty. A single shot has not yet been shown. But its consequences have already begun to reshape Summer Bay forever.